The radio crackled with static as 6 enemy aircraft appeared on radar, closing fast toward the naval fleet below. In the cockpit of her FA-18 Super Hornet, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Phoenix Mitchell felt her heart rate steady to that familiar combat rhythm she'd trained for years to achieve. But this wasn't a training exercise anymore. "Phoenix, you're outnumbered 6-1. Request immediate backup," came the voice from the carrier's control tower. Sarah's hands moved across the controls with practiced precision as she banked hard left, the G-forces pressing her deep into her seat. Below her, thousands of sailors depended on her success. Behind her, the voices of every instructor who told her she wasn't cut out for combat flying seemed to whisper in the wind. "Negative control," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I've got this." What happened in the next 20 minutes would not only change military aviation history forever, but would also silence every critic who ever questioned whether a woman belonged in the cockpit of a fighter jet. This is the true story of how one pilot's extraordinary skill, unshakable determination, and split-second decision-making turned what should have been a devastating defeat into the most legendary air-to-air combat victory of the modern era. Some called it impossible. Others called it luck. But those who witnessed it firsthand knew the truth. They had just seen the birth of a legend. Sarah Mitchell never planned to become a fighter pilot. Growing up in a small farming town in Iowa, she spent her childhood helping her father repair tractors and combines, her small hands surprisingly skilled at working with machinery that dwarfed her tiny frame. While other girls her age played with dolls, Sarah was fascinated by the crop dusters that flew over their fields, watching them dive and climb with an elegance that seemed to defy gravity itself. Her father, Tom Mitchell, was a practical man who believed in hard work and keeping your feet firmly planted on the ground. When 8-year-old Sarah announced she wanted to learn to fly, he chuckled and told her to focus on her studies instead. But Sarah's mother, Linda, saw something different in her daughter's eyes when she watched those planes. There was a hunger there, a longing that couldn't be satisfied by conventional dreams. The turning point came when Sarah was 12 years old. The annual county fair featured an aerobatic show, and Sarah begged her parents to take her. As they sat in the metal bleachers under the hot August sun, watching pilots perform impossible maneuvers in the sky above, Sarah felt something click into place deep inside her chest. This wasn't just what she wanted to do, this was who she was meant to be. But wanting something and achieving it were two very different things, especially for a girl from a farming family with no military connections and limited financial resources. Sarah's guidance counselor in high school was the first to plant seeds of doubt. When she announced her intention to apply for the Naval Academy, Mrs. Ken Henderson frowned and suggested she consider more realistic career paths. "Fighter pilots need to be aggressive, Sarah," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone adults use when they think they're being helpful. "You're such a sweet girl. Maybe consider being a teacher or a nurse instead." Sarah left that meeting with her jaw clenched and her determination doubled. She threw herself into her studies with an intensity that surprised even her parents. Math and physics became her obsessions. She joined the track team to build physical endurance and started lifting weights in the school's cramped gymnasium. Every spare moment was spent reading about military aviation, memorizing aircraft specifications, and studying the biographies of famous pilots. Her grades were exceptional, but the Naval Academy application process was more complex than anything she'd encountered. The physical fitness requirements alone seemed designed to weed out applicants like her. At 5'4" and 120 pounds, Sarah was smaller than most of the male applicants, but she made up for her size with relentless training. Every morning at 5 o'clock, she ran the country roads around her family's farm. The Iowa winter didn't stop her. She ran through snow, sleet, and temperatures that dropped well below zero. Her breath formed clouds in the frigid air as her feet pounded out a steady rhythm on the frozen ground. Other students thought she was crazy, but Sarah knew that if she wanted to compete with candidates from military families and prestigious prep schools, she had to be willing to work harder than anyone else.
The interview process was intimidating.
Sarah sat across from 3 naval officers in their crisp white uniforms, feeling acutely aware of her simple dress and small-town background. The questions came rapid fire. Why did she want to fly? What made her think she had what it takes? How would she handle the pressure of combat? "Miss Mitchell," said Captain Rodriguez, the senior officer on the panel, "fighter aviation is one of the most demanding careers in the military. It requires split-second decision-making under extreme stress, physical endurance beyond what most people can imagine, and the ability to function effectively in life-or-death situations. What makes you believe you're capable of handling those challenges?" Sarah took a deep breath, thinking about all those mornings running in the cold, all those evenings studying physics problems until her eyes burned with fatigue. Sir, I believe that determination and preparation can overcome almost any obstacle. I may not have the same background as other candidates, but I've spent every day for the past 4 years preparing for this opportunity. I'm willing to outwork anyone to prove I belong here. The officers exchanged glances, and Sarah couldn't read their expressions. The interview concluded with polite thanks and a promise that she would hear from them soon. As she walked out of the building, Sarah felt the weight of uncertainty settling on her shoulders like a heavy coat. 3 months later, the acceptance letter arrived. Sarah's mother found her in the barn, tears streaming down her face as she held the official envelope in her trembling hands. She had done it. She was going to the Naval Academy. But getting accepted was only the first hurdle. Plebe year at the academy was a systematic effort to break down every new midshipman and rebuild them in the military mold. For Sarah, who had never been away from home for more than a few days, the adjustment was brutal. The hazing from upper-class midshipmen was relentless. They seemed to take particular pleasure in targeting the female plebes, especially those who had expressed interest in aviation. Sarah's roommate, Jennifer, cracked under the pressure during the first month and transferred to a civilian college. She wasn't the only one. Nearly 20% of Sarah's class dropped out before Christmas. "Mitchell!" screamed first-class midshipman Barnes during a particularly grueling inspection. "Your rack looks like it was made by a blind monkey. You think the Navy is going to trust you with a multi-million-dollar aircraft when you can't even make a proper bed?" Sarah stood at attention, staring straight ahead as Barnes continued his tirade. Inside she was seething, but she had learned to channel that anger into fuel for her determination. That night, she practiced making her bed until she could do it perfectly in under 3 minutes, even in the dark. The academic workload was crushing. Engineering classes, military history, navigation, weapon systems. Sarah studied until late every night and was awake before dawn for physical training. Her grades were among the top in her class, but academic excellence wasn't enough. She needed to prove herself physically as well. The obstacle course became her nemesis. While her male classmates could muscle their way over the high walls and rope climbs, Sarah had to rely on technique and endurance. She spent extra hours in the gymnasium working with a patient upperclassman named Mike Torino, who saw potential in her unorthodox approach to physical challenges. "You're never going to overpower these obstacles, Mitchell," he told her as she struggled with the rope climb for the 100th time. "But you can outsmart them. Use your legs more and don't waste energy fighting the rope. Work with it." Gradually, Sarah's times improved. She learned to use her smaller size as an advantage, squeezing through tight spaces and finding handholds that bigger students missed. By the end of her first year, she was posting respectable times on every physical challenge. But the real test came during summer training. Sarah's first flight in a Navy training aircraft was everything she had dreamed it would be, and more. Strapped into the back seat of a T-34 Mentor, she felt the aircraft lift off the runway and climb into the blue Virginia sky. The sensation of flight was indescribable, like being released from the bonds of Earth itself. Her instructor, Lieutenant Commander Peterson, put the aircraft through a series of basic maneuvers, and Sarah felt her stomach lurch as they performed their first aileron roll. But instead of feeling sick, she felt exhilarated. This was where she belonged. "How are you doing back there, Mitchell?" Peterson's voice crackled through the intercom. "Outstanding, sir," Sarah replied, and she meant it. Despite the G-forces pressing her into her seat and the disorienting sensation of being inverted, she felt more at home than she ever had on the ground. When they returned to the airfield, Peterson made a note in her training record. Later, Sarah would learn that he had written "Natural Pilot Instincts. Recommend for advanced training." Those few words changed the trajectory of her entire career. But even as Sarah excelled in her flight training, she encountered resistance from unexpected sources. During her second year, she was called into the office of her faculty advisor, Commander Williams, for what she thought would be a routine academic review. "Mitchell, I've been watching your progress," he began, shuffling through her file. "Your grades are excellent, and your flight instructors speak highly of your abilities. But I want to make sure you're thinking realistically about your career goals." Sarah felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. "Sir, fighter aviation is extremely competitive," he continued. "Even male midshipmen with perfect records don't always get selected for jets. You might want to consider other specialties, perhaps multi-engine transport aircraft or helicopters. Those are more suitable for someone with your background." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. After everything she had accomplished, after proving herself again and again, she was still being told to lower her expectations. But instead of arguing, she simply nodded and thanked Commander Williams for his advice. That night, Sarah called home for the first time in weeks. Her father answered the phone, and she could hear the familiar sounds of the farm in the background, the low moo of cattle and the distant hum of machinery. "Dad," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "What if everyone's right? What if I'm just kidding myself about being good enough for this?" Tom Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that Sarah would carry with her for the rest of her career. "Sweetheart, I've watched you work since you were old enough to hold a wrench. You've never backed down from a challenge, and you've never let anyone tell you what you couldn't do. Don't start now." Sarah hung up the phone with renewed determination. She would prove them all wrong. Every instructor who had suggested she aim lower, every classmate who questioned whether women belonged in combat aircraft, every voice that whispered she wasn't good enough. She would earn her wings, and she would fly fighters. The next 2 years passed in a blur of intensive training and academic work. Sarah's flight scores continued to improve, and she developed a reputation among the instructors as someone who could handle any aircraft they put her in. She flew aerobatic sequences with precision that impressed even the most experienced pilots, and her academic understanding of aircraft systems was encyclopedic. By her senior year, Sarah was ranked in the top 5% of her class overall, and number 1 in aviation-related subjects. When service assignment night arrived, the ceremony where graduating midshipmen learned their career paths, Sarah sat in the auditorium with her heart pounding. When her name was called, she walked across the stage with as much composure as she could muster. The officer handed her an envelope, and Sarah opened it with trembling hands. Inside was her assignment: Naval Flight School, Pensacola, Florida. Track, fighter aircraft. She had done it. Against all the odds, despite all the doubters, Sarah Mitchell was going to fly fighters for the United States Navy. But as she would soon discover, getting the assignment was only the beginning. The real challenges lay ahead in the unforgiving skies over Pensacola, where she would learn that becoming a fighter pilot required more than just determination. It demanded skills and instincts that would one day save not only her own life, but the lives of thousands of others. The Florida sun was merciless as Sarah stepped out of her rental car at Naval Air Station Pensacola. The humid air hit her like a wall, and sweat immediately began beading on her forehead. This was it, the place where she would either earn her wings or wash out like so many others before her. Flight school was a different animal entirely from the Naval Academy. Here, everything revolved around one simple concept: learning to fly military aircraft in increasingly complex and dangerous situations. The washout rate was brutal. Nearly 40% of students never made it through the program. Sarah's first instructor was Lieutenant Jake Hammer Morrison, a former carrier pilot whose reputation for being tough but fair preceded him. During their initial briefing, he looked at her personnel file and raised an eyebrow. "So you're the farm girl who wants to fly Hornets," he said, not unkindly. "I've seen your academy records. Impressive. But out here, none of that matters. The only thing that counts is how you handle yourself in the cockpit when things go wrong. And trust me, things will go wrong." The training aircraft at Pensacola were a far cry from the gentle T-34 Sarah had flown during her academy summers. The T-6 Texan II was a high-performance trainer designed to push students to their limits. Sarah's first solo flight was scheduled for her 3rd week, assuming she could pass the pre-solo check ride. The morning of her check ride, Sarah arrived at the flight line 2 hours early to complete her pre-flight inspection. She walked around the aircraft methodically, checking every surface, every connection, every moving part. This ritual would become second nature to her, but that day it felt like the most important thing she had ever done. Lieutenant Morrison watched her pre-flight from a distance, noting how thoroughly she examined the aircraft. When she finished, he approached with his own checklist. "Tell me about the engine," he said simply. PT-68, 6.8 turboprop, 1,100 shaft horsepower, maximum operating altitude 31,000 feet. Sarah replied without hesitation. "Normal operating procedures call for—" "What happens if you lose engine power during takeoff?" Morrison interrupted. Sarah's mind raced through her emergency procedures training. "Below 500 feet AGL, maintain aircraft control, lower the nose, land straight ahead. Above 500 feet, attempt restart if altitude permits. Otherwise, execute forced landing pattern to suitable runway or field." Morrison nodded approvingly. They climbed into the cockpit, and Sarah strapped herself in with practiced efficiency. The pre-flight checks took 15 minutes, each step performed with meticulous attention to detail. Finally, Morrison gave her clearance to start the engine. The Pratt & Whitney turbine spooled up with a distinctive whine that Sarah felt in her bones. This was power unlike anything she had experienced before. As they taxied to the runway, Morrison began the verbal examination that would continue throughout the flight. "You're on final approach in heavy crosswinds," he said as Sarah lined up with the runway centerline. "Wind is 280 degrees at 25 knots, gusting to 35. Runway is 09. Talk me through your landing technique." Sarah's hands moved instinctively on the controls as she visualized the scenario. Crab into the wind to maintain runway centerline. Slightly higher approach speed to account for gusts. Prepare for rudder input to straighten the aircraft just before touchdown. If the crosswind component exceeds aircraft limitations, execute a go-around. "Show me," Morrison said. For the next hour and a half, Morrison put Sarah through every conceivable emergency and unusual situation. Simulated engine failures, electrical malfunctions, radio problems, severe turbulence, each scenario designed to test not just her technical knowledge, but her ability to think clearly under pressure. The defining moment came when Morrison suddenly pulled the throttle to idle and announced, "Engine failure. 2,000 feet, no suitable airports within gliding distance." Sarah's training took over. She immediately lowered the nose to maintain best glide speed, turned toward the nearest road that could serve as an emergency landing site, and began running through the emergency checklist. All the while, she maintained radio contact with the tower, declaring her emergency and providing position updates. "Time to impact, 2 minutes," Morrison announced, continuing the simulation. Sarah scanned the terrain below, identifying power lines, vehicles, and other obstacles. She selected a straight section of country road and began setting up her approach pattern. Her heart was pounding, but her hands remained steady on the controls. Just as they reached 500 feet above the road, Morrison pushed the throttle forward and said, "Okay, recover. Nice work." They climbed back to altitude, and Morrison was quiet for several minutes. Sarah could feel his evaluation continuing, but she focused on flying smooth, precise maneuvers and maintaining situational awareness. When they finally returned to Pensacola and landed, Morrison made several notes in his gradebook before speaking. "Mitchell, that was one of the better check rides I've seen this month. You're cleared for solo flight." Sarah felt a surge of pride, but Morrison wasn't finished. "Don't let it go to your head," he continued. "The solo is just the beginning. From here, things get a lot more complicated." Her first solo flight was a revelation. Alone in the cockpit for the first time, Sarah felt the full responsibility of controlling a high-performance aircraft. Every decision was hers to make, every mistake would be hers to own. As she climbed through 5,000 feet into the crystal-clear Florida sky, she understood why so many pilots described flying as addictive. The weeks that followed brought increasingly challenging training. Formation flying, where aircraft operated just a few feet apart at high speeds. Instrument flying, where Sarah had to control the aircraft using only the gauges while wearing a hood that blocked her view outside. Night flying, which transformed the familiar landscape into an alien world of scattered lights and invisible hazards. Each phase of training eliminated more students. Sarah watched classmates who had seemed destined for success suddenly struggle with specific aspects of military flying. Some had trouble with the physical demands. The G-forces during aggressive maneuvering could be overwhelming for pilots who weren't in peak physical condition. Others struggled with the mental pressure of making split-second decisions while managing complex aircraft systems. Sarah's background on the farm served her well during the maintenance phases of training. While other students were intimidated by the complex mechanical systems, Sarah understood instinctively how machines worked. She spent extra time in the maintenance hangar, learning from the experienced mechanics who kept the training fleet flying. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, the senior maintenance supervisor, took a particular interest in Sarah's mechanical aptitude. "Most pilots think the aircraft is magic," he told her one afternoon as she helped troubleshoot a hydraulic problem. "They push buttons and expect things to work. But you understand that every system is connected to every other system. That knowledge will save your life someday." The academics at flight school were as demanding as the flying. Sarah studied aerodynamics, weather patterns, navigation systems, and emergency procedures with the same intensity she had brought to her Naval Academy coursework. Her room was filled with charts, manuals, and technical publications. While other students relaxed in the evenings, Sarah could be found in the base library, memorizing the performance characteristics of every aircraft she might someday fly. The social dynamics at flight school were complex. Sarah was one of only 3 women in her class, and the attention that brought wasn't always welcome. Some of her male classmates treated her as an oddity, while others seemed to view her as a challenge to overcome. A few genuinely accepted her as an equal, and those relationships became crucial to her success. Among her closest friends was David Tank Peterson, a former enlisted sailor who had earned his commission through sheer determination. Tank understood what it was like to be an outsider in the traditional military aviation culture, and he and Sarah often studied together, sharing notes and helping each other through difficult concepts. "You know what I like about you, Mitchell," he told her one evening as they reviewed weather theory. "You never act like you have anything to prove. You just do the work and let your performance speak for itself." Sarah appreciated the sentiment, but the truth was more complicated. She felt enormous pressure to excel, not just for herself, but for every woman who might follow in her footsteps. Every mistake was magnified, every success scrutinized. She couldn't afford to be merely good, she had to be exceptional. The pressure intensified during the instrument training phase. Flying solely by reference to gauges while wearing a hood that blocked outside vision required a different kind of mental discipline. Students had to trust their instruments even when their inner ear told them they were flying straight and level. But the attitude indicator showed a steep bank. Sarah's first instrument check ride was with Commander Patricia Steele Williams, one of the few female instructor pilots at Pensacola. Commander Williams had a reputation for being particularly demanding, and Sarah knew she would receive no special consideration because they were both women.
The check ride began normally, with basic instrument maneuvers and navigation exercises.
But 45 minutes into the flight, Commander Williams began introducing emergencies at a rapid pace. Simulated engine failure, followed immediately by electrical problems, then a simulated fire warning. "Talk me through your priorities," Williams commanded as alarms sounded in the cockpit. Sarah's training took over. "Maintain aircraft control first, analyze the malfunction, take appropriate action," she recited while simultaneously working through the emergency checklist. Her hands moved efficiently across the cockpit, silencing alarms and configuring systems. "You've just lost all electrical power," Williams announced. "No radio, no navigation instruments, weather is deteriorating. What's your plan?" Sarah felt her heart rate spike, but her voice remained calm. "Turn toward the nearest VFR conditions, maintain safe altitude, prepare for dead stick approach to closest suitable airfield." She was already calculating distances and fuel consumption in her head, building a mental picture of her options. Williams continued the simulation for another 20 minutes, layering crisis upon crisis. By the end, Sarah's flight suit was soaked with sweat, but she had successfully handled every emergency thrown at her. After they landed, Williams was characteristically blunt in her evaluation. "Mitchell, you've got good instincts and excellent technical knowledge. But more importantly, you don't panic when things go to hell. That's the difference between pilots who make it and pilots who don't." The advanced phases of flight school introduced Sarah to the aircraft she would eventually fly in the fleet. The T-45 Goshawk was a carrier-capable trainer that simulated many of the challenges she would face flying from aircraft carriers. The approach speeds were higher, the landing pattern more demanding, and the margin for error smaller than anything she had experienced before. Carrier qualification was the ultimate test. Students had to prove they could land on a moving aircraft carrier, a skill that even experienced pilots found challenging. The carrier deck was only about 500 feet long, and it was moving at 30 knots through the ocean. Landing required precision, measured in feet and seconds. Sarah's first carrier qualification period took place aboard the USS Lexington, a training carrier operating in the Gulf of Mexico. The night before her first approach, she stood on the deck looking out at the seemingly impossibly small landing area. Other students gathered around her, all sharing the same mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Looks smaller than it did in the videos," said Mike Chen, another student in her class. "The key is to trust your training," replied Tank Peterson. "Don't overthink it. The aircraft knows how to land. You just have to guide it to the right spot." Sarah spent hours that evening reviewing the landing procedures, memorizing the sight picture for the correct approach angle and the hand signals from the landing signal officer who would guide her to the deck. She went to sleep with visions of aircraft carriers dancing in her head. The morning of her first approach dawned clear and calm. Perfect conditions for a nervous student pilot. Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection with extra care, knowing that any mechanical problem would mean a potentially catastrophic emergency with no opportunity to land at a conventional airport. As she strapped into the T-45, Sarah felt the familiar pre-flight butterflies mixed with intense excitement. This was the moment she had been training for since that first flight at the Naval Academy. Everything else had been preparation for this. The launch from the carrier was unlike anything she had experienced. The steam catapult accelerated her aircraft from 0 to 150 miles per hour in less than 3 seconds, pressing her back into her seat with tremendous force. One moment she was sitting on the deck, and the next she was climbing rapidly into the blue Gulf sky. Her first approach was too high. and the landing signal officer waved her off before she could attempt to land. The second approach was better, but she was slightly off centerline and received another wave off. By her third approach, Sarah had settled into the rhythm of carrier aviation. "Looking good, Mitchell," came the voice of the LSO through her headset. "Little power, you're settling. Right for lineup, right for lineup. Easy with it. Perfect." The aircraft touched down with a satisfying thump, and the arresting cable brought her to a stop in less than 300 feet. Sarah had successfully landed on an aircraft carrier for the first time, and the sense of accomplishment was overwhelming. Over the next week, she completed the required number of day and night landings to qualify for carrier operations. Each landing built her confidence and refined her technique. By the end of the detachment, she was landing consistently in all weather conditions, day and night. The final phase of flight school was weapons training, where students learned to employ the systems they would use in combat. Sarah mastered air-to-air gunnery, dropping practice bombs on target ranges, and launching training missiles at aerial targets. Her scores were consistently among the highest in her class. The culmination of flight school was the final check ride with the commanding officer, Captain Robert "Shark" Thompson. This flight would determine whether students received their wings or were eliminated from the program just short of graduation. Captain Thompson had a reputation for finding weaknesses that other instructors missed. His check rides were legendary for their difficulty, and more than a few students who had sailed through the rest of flight school found themselves eliminated on his final evaluation. "Miss Mitchell," he said during the brief, "I've been watching your progress through the program. Your instructors speak very highly of your abilities. But I want to see for myself what you're made of." The flight lasted 3 hours and covered every skill Sarah had learned during her time at Pensacola. Formation flying, instruments, aerobatics, emergency procedures, navigation, and carrier simulation approaches. Captain Thompson's evaluation was relentless and comprehensive. The defining moment came when he simulated a complete electrical failure during a low-level navigation exercise. Sarah was flying at 500 feet above the ground, navigating by visual references, when suddenly every electrical system in the aircraft went dark. No radio, no navigation instruments, no transponder. "You've lost everything," Thompson announced. "Show me how you get home." Sarah immediately began climbing to a safer altitude while scanning the terrain for landmarks. She had memorized the location of every airport within 100 miles of Pensacola, and she began calculating her position based on visual references. Without a radio, she couldn't coordinate with air traffic control, so she had to choose her route carefully to avoid busy airspace. 20 minutes later, she was flying a visual approach to Pensacola, using hand signals to communicate with the control tower. Thompson had remained silent during her entire recovery, taking notes but offering no guidance. It was exactly the kind of self-reliant problem-solving that would be required in combat. After they landed, Thompson spent several minutes reviewing his notes before speaking. "Mitchell, in 30 years of flying and 15 years of instruction, I've rarely seen such a combination of technical skill and operational judgment. You have my strongest recommendation for fighter aircraft." 2 weeks later, at the flight school graduation ceremony, Sarah walked across the stage to receive her wings of gold. As the commanding officer pinned the wings to her uniform, she thought about her father back on the farm in Iowa and all the people who had told her to lower her expectations. She had earned her wings, but as she would soon discover, the real test was just beginning. Her next assignment would take her to the fleet, where she would learn to fly one of the most sophisticated fighter aircraft ever built, the FA-18 Super Hornet. And somewhere in the future, though she couldn't know it yet, those skills would be put to the ultimate test in a 20-minute air battle that would change her life forever. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in all directions as Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood on the flight deck of the USS Ronald Reagan, watching the organized chaos of carrier operations unfold around her. 6 months had passed since she'd received her wings at Pensacola, and now she was about to begin the most challenging phase of her aviation career, learning to fly the FA-180 Super Hornet in operational conditions. The transition to fleet service was jarring. Flight school had been demanding, but it was also controlled and predictable. Here on the carrier, Sarah found herself part of a precisely choreographed dance that never stopped. Aircraft launched and recovered around the clock. Maintenance crews worked in shifts to keep the jets operational, and pilots prepared for missions that could range from routine training flights to real-world combat operations. Her new squadron, VFA-41 Black Aces, had a reputation for excellence that went back to World War II. The squadron's commanding officer, Commander Rick Viper Harrison, had flown combat missions over Iraq and Afghanistan, and he expected nothing less than perfection from his pilots. "Mitchell," he said during her first squadron meeting, "I've read your training records. Impressive stuff. But out here, everything you've learned gets put to the test in ways you can't imagine. The Super Hornet isn't just a bigger, faster version of what you've been flying. It's a completely different animal, with capabilities and complexities that will challenge everything you think you know about aviation. The FAE 180 was indeed a revelation. Where the training aircraft Sarah had flown were relatively simple machines, the Super Hornet was a flying computer filled with the most advanced avionics and weapon systems in the world. The learning curve was steep, and Sarah threw herself into mastering every aspect of the aircraft with characteristic determination. Her instructor pilot in the squadron was Lieutenant Commander Marcus Jazz Williams, a veteran with over 1,000 hours in the Super Hornet and 2 combat deployments under his belt. Jazz had initially been skeptical about training a female pilot, not because he doubted Sarah's abilities, but because he worried about the additional pressure she would face in what was still very much a male-dominated environment.
Here's the deal, Mitchell,
he told her before their first flight together. I'm going to train you exactly the same way I'd train any other new pilot. No special treatment, no kid gloves. If you can't keep up, I'll recommend you for transfer to a different aircraft. But if you can handle what I throw at you, you'll be as good as any pilot in this squadron. Their first flight was a basic familiarization hop, designed to get Sarah comfortable with the Super Hornet's handling characteristics. As they taxied to the catapult, Jazz explained the differences between carrier operations and the training she had received. The cat shot is going to feel different in this bird, he said through the intercom. More violent, because we're heavier and faster. Don't fight the acceleration, just hold on and enjoy the ride. The catapult launch was everything Jazz had promised and more. The Super Hornet accelerated from 0 to 165 miles per hour in less than 3 seconds, pressing Sarah back into her ejection seat with tremendous force. One moment they were sitting on the deck, and the next they were climbing rapidly into the western Pacific sky. How you doing back there, Mitchell? Jazz asked as they leveled off at 20,000 feet. Outstanding, sir, Sarah replied, and she meant it. The Super Hornet felt powerful and responsive in ways that her training aircraft never had. The flight controls were crisp and precise, and the aircraft seemed to anticipate her inputs. Over the next hour, Jazz put the aircraft through its paces, demonstrating the Super Hornet's incredible performance envelope. They performed high G-turns that pressed Sarah deep into her seat, vertical climbs that seemed to defy gravity, and high-speed dashes that blurred the ocean surface below. Your turn, Jazz said, handing control over to Sarah. Show me a 360-degree turn at 7 Gs. Sarah took the controls and rolled into a steep bank, pulling back on the stick to tighten the turn. The G-forces built quickly, and she felt her vision starting to tunnel as the blood drained from her head. But her anti-G suit inflated to counteract the effects, and she maintained consciousness throughout the maneuver. Nice, Jazz commented. Most new pilots either don't pull enough Gs, or they pull too many and black out. You found the sweet spot. The weeks that followed were a blur of intensive training. Sarah learned to operate the aircraft's sophisticated radar system, which could track dozens of targets simultaneously while distinguishing between friendly and hostile aircraft. She mastered the weapon systems, practicing employment of everything from air-to-air missiles to precision-guided bombs. The night flying was particularly challenging. Landing on a carrier in daylight required precision, but doing it in darkness pushed pilots to their absolute limits. The deck was lit by a few scattered lights, but beyond that was nothing but black ocean in every direction. Pilots had to trust their instruments completely while making split-second adjustments based on visual cues from the landing signal officers. Sarah's first night trap was terrifying. As she approached the carrier in complete darkness, she could barely make out the dim outline of the ship against the black water. The only reference points were the faint lights of the flight deck and the glowing ball of the Fresnel lens optical landing system that helped guide aircraft to the proper approach angle. Mitchell, you're on glide path on centerline, came the voice of the LSO through her headset. Looking good. Continue. The approach seemed to last forever, though in reality it took less than 2 minutes. Sarah fought the urge to overthink her inputs, trusting her training and the aircraft systems to guide her to the deck. The landing was firm but controlled, and the arresting cable brought her to a stop in the usual spine-jarring fashion.
Nice trap, Jazz said as they taxied clear of the landing area. That was better than my first night approach.
As Sarah gained experience in the Super Hornet, she began to participate in more complex training exercises.
The squadron practiced air-to-air combat scenarios where pilots engaged in mock dogfights against sophisticated adversary aircraft. These exercises pushed both pilot and machine to their limits, with aircraft maneuvering at high speeds and pulling extreme G-forces in attempts to gain tactical advantage. During one particularly intense training mission, Sarah found herself in a simulated dogfight against Lieutenant Mike "Torch" Rodriguez, one of the most experienced pilots in the squadron. Rodriguez had a reputation as an aggressive fighter pilot with exceptional situational awareness, and he rarely lost in practice combat. The engagement began at high altitude, with both aircraft approaching each other head-on at a combined speed of over 1,200 miles per hour. As they passed, both pilots pulled hard turns to position themselves for a killing shot. The battle that followed was a three-dimensional chess match played at supersonic speeds. Rodriguez had the initial advantage, using his experience to maneuver into a favorable position behind Sarah's aircraft. But Sarah had been studying his techniques, and she executed an unexpected maneuver that reversed their positions. "Where'd she go?" Rodriguez asked over the radio, momentarily losing sight of Sarah's aircraft. "Behind you," Sarah replied, as she achieved a missile lock on Rodriguez's Super Hornet. In actual combat, the engagement would have been over, but the training rules allowed the fight to continue. For the next 10 minutes, the two aircraft engaged in an aerial ballet of attack and evasion. Both pilots pulled G-forces that pushed their aircraft and their bodies to the edge of their performance envelopes. Sarah found herself inverted at one point, pulling 8.5 Gs while trying to track Rodriguez's aircraft through a complex series of rolls and turns. Finally, Sarah managed to maneuver into a position where she could achieve a sustained missile lock. "Fox 2, she called, indicating a simulated heat-seeking missile shot. "Rodriguez, you're dead." After they landed, Rodriguez sought out Sarah on the flight line. "Mitchell, that was some impressive flying," he said, pulling off his helmet. "That reversal move you pulled was beautiful. I've never seen anyone do that in their first 6 months in the bird." Word of Sarah's performance spread through the squadron, and she began to gain a reputation as a pilot with exceptional instincts and tactical awareness. Commander Harrison took notice and began assigning her to increasingly challenging missions. The real test came during a major fleet exercise in the Western Pacific. The Reagan Carrier Strike Group was participating in a large-scale war game that included forces from multiple Allied nations. Sarah's squadron was tasked with conducting defensive counter-air missions, protecting the carrier group from simulated enemy attacks. The exercise scenario was complex and realistic. Intelligence reports indicated that opposing forces had deployed submarines, surface ships, and aircraft in an attempt to locate and attack the carrier. Sarah and her wingman, Lieutenant Jennifer "Spike" Torres, were launched on a combat air patrol mission designed to intercept any hostile aircraft that approached the battle group. 2 hours into their patrol, the ship's Combat Information Center detected multiple radar contacts approaching from the north. The contacts were identified as hostile aircraft, probably fighters attempting to conduct a reconnaissance mission or coordinate an attack on the carrier. "Phoenix, this is Strike," came the voice of the air controller aboard the Reagan. "We have multiple bogies bearing 010 degrees, range 150 miles, heading south at high speed. You are cleared to investigate and engage." Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she turned her aircraft toward the threat. This was as close to actual combat as she had ever been, even though it was only an exercise. The pilots she was about to face were experienced adversaries flying sophisticated aircraft, and they would be using every tactic at their disposal to complete their mission. "Spike, let's climb to Angels 25, Sarah said, directing her wingman to 25,000 feet. "We'll use the altitude advantage to control the engagement." As they climbed, Sarah activated her aircraft's radar and began searching for the hostile aircraft. The Super Hornet's APG-79 radar was incredibly capable, able to detect and track targets at ranges exceeding 100 miles while simultaneously jamming enemy radar systems. "I've got 4 contacts," Sarah reported. "Bearing 015 degrees, range 120 miles, heading 180 degrees at 450 knots. Looks like a standard 4-ship formation." The engagement that followed tested every skill Sarah had learned during her training. The opposing pilots were experienced and aggressive, using sophisticated tactics to try to break through Sarah's defensive screen. They employed electronic countermeasures to jam her radar, executed complex maneuvering to avoid her missiles, and coordinated their attacks to overwhelm her ability to respond. But Sarah and Spike worked together seamlessly, using their training in the Super Hornet's advanced systems to maintain control of the battle. They achieved multiple missile shots against the opposing aircraft, while avoiding the simulated weapons fired at them. When the exercise concluded, they had successfully prevented the enemy formation from reaching their target. After landing, the squadron held a detailed debrief of the mission. The exercise controllers praised Sarah's tactical decision-making and her ability to coordinate with her wingman under pressure. Commander Harrison was particularly impressed with her performance. Mitchell, that was textbook defensive counter-air, he said after reviewing the mission tapes. You controlled the geometry of the engagement, used your systems effectively, and achieved your objectives without taking unnecessary risks. That's exactly the kind of flying we need from our pilots. But even as Sarah gained recognition for her flying skills, she continued to face challenges that had nothing to do with aviation. Some squadron members still questioned whether women belonged in combat aircraft, and Sarah occasionally overheard comments that suggested her success was due to lowered standards or special treatment. The situation came to a head during a squadron social event at the Officers' Club. Sarah was discussing a recent training mission with several other pilots when Lieutenant Brad Slider Matthews made a comment that stopped the conversation cold. "You know, it's great that the Navy is being progressive and all," he said, clearly having had too much to drink. "But I still think combat aviation is a man's job. Women just don't have the same killer instinct." The room went quiet, and all eyes turned to Sarah. She could feel her anger rising, but she forced herself to remain calm. This wasn't the first time she had heard such comments, and it wouldn't be the last. "Slider," she said evenly, "I seem to recall shooting you down twice during last week's training mission. Maybe you'd like to explain how my lack of killer instinct affected your performance." Several pilots laughed, and Matthews's face reddened. But instead of backing down, he doubled down on his comments. "Training is one thing, Mitchell. Combat is different. When real bullets start flying, we'll see who has what it takes." Commander Harrison, who had been listening from across the room, intervened before the situation could escalate further. "That's enough, Matthews. I suggest you think carefully about what you just said." Later, Harrison pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that," he said. "Matthews is a good pilot, but he's got some outdated ideas about women in aviation. Don't let his ignorance affect your performance." "It doesn't bother me, sir," Sarah replied, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. "I've been dealing with that attitude since the academy. I just let my flying do the talking." "That's exactly the right approach," Harrison said. "And for what it's worth, you've got nothing to prove to anyone in this squadron. Your performance speaks for itself." As the months passed, Sarah continued to excel in her role as a Super Hornet pilot. She completed her carrier qualifications, mastered the aircraft's weapon systems, and earned a reputation as one of the most skilled pilots in the squadron. Her flying was characterized by precision, tactical awareness, and an ability to remain calm under pressure that impressed even the most experienced aviators. But none of her training had prepared her for what was coming. In a few short months, the Reagan Carrier Strike Group would be deployed to a region where tensions were running high, and the possibility of actual combat was very real. Sarah would soon face a test that would push her skills, her aircraft, and her courage to their absolute limits. The stage was being set for an air battle that would become legendary in naval aviation history. And at the center of it all would be a young woman from Iowa who had spent her entire life proving that she belonged in the cockpit of a fighter jet. The doubters who questioned her abilities were about to learn just how wrong they had been. The alarm that pierced the pre-dawn darkness aboard the USS Ronald Reagan wasn't the routine call to general quarters that Sarah had grown accustomed to during their deployment. This was different, urgent, insistent, carrying with it the unmistakable tone of genuine emergency. As she rolled out of her narrow bunk, Sarah could feel the carrier changing course beneath her feet, the massive ship turning to position itself for combat operations. It was 0430 hours, 3 days after her first close encounter with enemy aircraft. Sarah had been catching a few hours of rest between Alert 5 rotations when the call came. As she pulled on her flight suit and grabbed her survival gear, she could hear the sound of aircraft engines starting on the flight deck above. Whatever was happening, it was big enough to launch aircraft in the middle of the night. The ready room was chaos when Sarah arrived. Intelligence officers were briefing pilots on a rapidly developing situation, while maintenance crews rushed to prepare additional aircraft for launch. Commander Harrison stood at the front of the room, his face grim as he waited for the last of his pilots to assemble. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice cutting through the noise, "we have a problem. At 0400, our early warning aircraft detected a large formation of hostile aircraft launching from multiple bases. Current count is 24 aircraft in 4 separate groups, all heading toward our position. Intelligence assesses this as a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm our defenses and potentially sink the Reagan." Sarah felt her blood run cold. 24 aircraft represented a massive assault force, far larger than anything they had prepared for during training. The standard defensive protocols called for launching 8 to 12 fighters to counter such a threat, but mechanical problems had reduced VFA 4-1's available aircraft to just 6. "What's our response, sir?" asked Lieutenant Commander Jazz Williams. Harrison's expression was grave. We're launching everything we've got, but it's not enough. Maintenance is working on getting more birds up, but we need at least an hour. The first wave of attackers will be here in 45 minutes. Sarah did the math in her head and didn't like the result. Even with perfect defensive tactics, 6 fighters against 24 attackers meant each American pilot would have to engage 4 enemy aircraft. Those were impossible odds, especially against pilots flying some of the most advanced fighters in the world. Phoenix, Harrison said, looking directly at Sarah. You and Torch are our most experienced section. I'm putting you in tactical command of the defensive formation. Your job is to buy us time for the rest of the strike group to get additional fighters airborne. The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a physical burden. In the next hour, the lives of 5,000 sailors aboard the Reagan would depend on her tactical decisions and flying skills. She thought briefly of her father back on the farm in Iowa, of all the instructors who had told her to lower her expectations, of Lieutenant Matthews, who had questioned whether women had the killer instinct for combat. "Roger, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "We'll hold them off." 20 minutes later, Sarah was strapped into her FAP-18 Super Hornet, conducting the most important pre-flight check of her career. Every system had to be perfect, every weapon ready for immediate use. Martinez, her plane captain, completed his inspection with unusual thoroughness. "Ma'am, she's never been better," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "All systems green, full fuel load, and your missiles are hot. Bring everyone home safe." The catapult launch was routine, but as Sarah climbed into the dark Pacific sky, she knew this would be unlike any mission she had ever flown. Behind her, 5 other Super Hornets formed up in tactical formation. They were outnumbered 4-1, but they were flying the most advanced fighters in the world, piloted by some of the best-trained aviators on the planet. "Devil Flight, this is Strike," came the voice of the ship's air controller. Picture shows multiple groups of bogies inbound from the northwest. Lead group bearing 315 degrees range. 150 miles, estimated 24 aircraft total. You are clear to intercept and engage. Sarah activated her aircraft's powerful APG-79 radar and began searching for the incoming threat. At maximum range, she detected the first group of aircraft, 6 fighters flying in tight formation at high altitude. They were still 120 miles away, but closing rapidly. Strike, Phoenix has contact on lead group bearing 315 degrees, range 120 miles. 6 aircraft in formation, heading southeast at 600 knots. Request picture on remaining groups. Phoenix, second group bearing 340 degrees, range 130 miles. Third group bearing 300 degrees, range 140 miles. Fourth group appears to be in reserve, range 180 miles. All groups assessed as hostile fighters with full air-to-air loadouts. Sarah quickly calculated the tactical situation. The enemy was using a classic overwhelming attack pattern, with multiple groups approaching from different directions to split the defensive formation. If she tried to engage all groups simultaneously, her small force would be quickly overwhelmed. She needed a different approach. "Devil Flight, Phoenix," she said over the radio. "We're going to use hit-and-run tactics. We'll engage the lead group with long-range missiles, then extend and reposition before the other groups can support. Torch, take Bandit and Slider and position south of the lead group. Steel and Razor, come with me. We'll attack from the north." It was a risky plan that violated the standard doctrine of keeping defensive fighters concentrated, but against overwhelming odds, Sarah knew that conventional tactics would only result in all 6 American aircraft being shot down. By splitting her force, she could attack the enemy from multiple directions and potentially achieve surprise. "Phoenix, Strike. Be advised. Lead group has just activated electronic jamming systems. They know you're coming." Sarah watched her radar display dissolve into static as powerful jamming signals disrupted her senses. But the Super Hornet's advanced electronic warfare systems adapted quickly, burning through the interference to reacquire the enemy formation. They were now only 80 miles away and closing fast. "Devil Flight, prepare for missile engagement," Sarah ordered. "Target the lead aircraft in each formation. Fox 3, on my mark." At 60 miles, Sarah achieved a solid radar lock on the enemy formation leader. Her finger moved to the missile release button, but she waited for the optimal firing solution. The AIM-120 AMRAM missiles were deadly accurate, but only if fired under the right conditions. "Fox 3!" Sarah called, launching her first missile. Around her, the other 5 Super Hornets fired almost simultaneously, sending 6 long-range missiles streaking toward the enemy formation at Mach 4. The enemy pilots reacted immediately, breaking formation and maneuvering violently to avoid the incoming missiles. Sarah watched on her radar as 2 enemy aircraft disappeared from her screen, direct hits. The remaining 4 aircraft of the lead group scattered, their formation destroyed, and their attack coordination broken. Devil Flight, extend north and prepare for second engagement, Sarah ordered. Lead group is scattered but still a threat. Second group will be in missile range in 3 minutes. But as her formation turned north to reposition, Sarah's radar warning receiver erupted with alarms. The second group of enemy aircraft had achieved missile lock-ons and was launching their own long-range weapons. "Missiles inbound!" called Lieutenant Torres from Devil 4. Multiple arm rams tracking from the northwest. Sarah threw her aircraft into a violent defensive maneuver, dispensing chaff and flares while executing a series of high G turns designed to break the missile lock-ons. The Super Hornet's electronic countermeasures worked perfectly, causing 2 enemy missiles to lose lock and detonate harmlessly. But the defensive maneuvering had cost valuable time and position. "Devil Flight, reform and prepare for close-range engagement," Sarah commanded. Second group is closing fast, range 30 miles and decreasing. What followed was the most intense air-to-air combat engagement in decades. 24 enemy fighters against 6 American aircraft, fighting in a 3-dimensional battle space that covered hundreds of square miles of Pacific Ocean. Aircraft maneuvered at speeds exceeding 800 miles per hour, pulling G-forces that pushed both pilots and machines to their absolute limits. Sarah found herself in a turning fight with 2 enemy aircraft, both of them trying to maneuver behind her for a killing shot. She pulled her Super Hornet through a series of violent maneuvers, using every technique she had learned during years of training. The G-forces pressed her deep into her ejection seat, and she fought to maintain consciousness as the blood drained from her brain. "Phoenix, you've got 2 on your 6, called Rodriguez from across the battlefield. "I'm coming to help, but I'm engaged with 3 bandits myself." Sarah executed a desperate defensive maneuver, pulling straight up into a vertical climb that bled off her airspeed, but caused the pursuing enemy aircraft to overshoot her position. As the first enemy fighter flashed past her canopy, she rolled inverted and pulled down behind him, achieving a perfect firing position. "Fox 2, she called, firing a heat-seeking Sidewinder missile at point-blank range. The missile tracked perfectly, striking the enemy aircraft in the engine bay and destroying it in a brilliant fireball. But there was no time to celebrate. The second enemy aircraft had maneuvered to attack position and was preparing to fire. Sarah threw her aircraft into another violent defensive maneuver, but this time the enemy pilot anticipated her move and stayed in position for the shot. Sarah was out of options and out of time. The enemy aircraft had a perfect firing solution, and in seconds she would be dead. But as the enemy pilot prepared to fire, a Sidewinder missile from Lieutenant Torres' aircraft struck the attacker from the side, destroying it instantly.
"Thanks for the save, Razor," Sarah said, her voice shaky with adrenaline.
"Don't mention it, Phoenix, but we've got a problem. I just took a hit from an AMRAAM. My engine is damaged and I'm leaking fuel. I need to return to the ship immediately." Sarah quickly assessed the tactical situation. In the past 10 minutes of intense combat, her formation had shot down 8 enemy aircraft, but they had lost one of their own and another was damaged. The remaining enemy aircraft were regrouping for another attack, and more fighters were approaching from the northwest. "Strike, Phoenix," she called to the ship's air controller. "Devil 4 is returning to base with battle damage. We've engaged multiple groups and achieved 8 kills, but we're low on missiles and fuel. Request immediate backup." "Phoenix, strike. Negative on immediate backup. We're still working on getting additional aircraft airborne. You need to hold for another 10 minutes minimum." 10 minutes might as well have been 10 hours. Sarah looked at her fuel gauges and weapon status display. She had 2 missiles left and barely enough fuel to make it back to the carrier. Around her, the remaining 4 aircraft of her formation were in similar condition. But as she prepared for the next engagement, something extraordinary happened. The enemy formation, which had been pressing their attack relentlessly, suddenly began withdrawing to the northwest. Sarah couldn't believe what she was seeing on her radar display. "Strike, Phoenix. Enemy aircraft appear to be withdrawing. Repeat, all hostile aircraft are departing to the northwest. Phoenix, strike. Confirm enemy withdrawal. Outstanding job, Devil Flight. You are cleared to return to base." As Sarah turned her battered formation back toward the Reagan, she tried to understand what had just happened. Her small force had been outnumbered 4-1, but they had fought with such